Daniel Gordis, self-criticism, as you write, is a fundamental feature of the Israeli nation. What does the self-criticism mean exactly, and where does it come from? For example, how does it influence Israel's political system? As we can see these days, it is very difficult to form a coalition government.
Well, forming the government has nothing to do with self-criticism. Those are totally separate issues. The self-criticism comes from an awareness. In Israel, there is an ongoing tradition of looking at the way in which Israel has taken decisions and being willing to criticize them. I think the society is very much now engaged in a very heartfelt re-examination of the relationship between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs and trying to figure out how we got to where we are. There have been periods when Israel's been involved in wars, when it's been not only acceptable, but actually very much appreciated for people to say that we should have done this or we should have done that differently. In the War of Independence, for example, in 1948, when an Israeli poet published a poem talking about what he alleged to have been some misdeed on the part of an Israeli soldier, David Ben-Gurion actually asked permission to have the poem printed in thousands of copies, and he wanted the poem put into the pocket of every single Israeli soldier so that they would recognize that there's a higher moral standard that they have to be held to. This is not a country that shuts down critics. This is not a country that jails critics. This is not a country that stops people from sharing their opinions, whether it's on television or in the press. It's embraced. Not everybody agrees with it, but that's what freedom of the press and democracy means.
When you write about Israel, you define yourself as a centrist. So please tell me, what is an Israeli centrist? How is centrist, for example, different from left or right in Israel?
Okay, that's a good question. So I think that the way a centrist, here's where I think on the far left in Israel, and there's not much of this, but there's a little bit of it. On the far left of Israel, you have people who believe that the idea of having a Jewish state is already no longer a good idea, and they are in favor of some sort of just general democracy like France, Germany, et cetera, et cetera. Then a more moderate left would be to say that they believe in the importance of a Jewish state, but they think that Israel bears a very significant portion of the blame for the fact that we've been in a conflict now for about 100 years with the Arabs in this area. Obviously, Israel's not 100 years old. It's 73 years old, but the conflict predates the state. So I don't agree with that necessarily. And so that puts me not on the left. On the far right, you have really, extreme right, you have people who say that the Arabs should be expelled or something like that. It's a very small number. It's a fringe, but you do have some of that. And then on the more moderate right, you have people who say there's really no realistic possibility of reaching agreement with them. So there's really no point trying. We're just going to be at war as far as the eye can see. It's unfortunate, it's sad, but that's what it is. And we just have to accept it. So I don't buy that either. In other words, I think what makes me a centrist is that I definitely believe in the importance and the legitimacy of a Jewish state. And yet it's also very important to me that the Arab population inside Israel and the Arab population outside Israel live in dignity and ideally even have a state of their own. I'm not a leftist because I actually think that the responsibility for the fact that they don't have that yet lies with them. I think that, there's things that Israel could have or should have done differently, but fundamentally, if you want to know why there is no Palestinian state, the responsibility for that rests at the feet of the Palestinians, not at the feet of the Israelis. But I'm not prepared to give up trying, which is why I'm not on the right. So not on the left and not on the right, I think puts me in the center.
So you don't give up on two-state solution?
No, either that or something else. But I haven't given up on the idea that Palestinians should live in dignity with their ability to chart their own destiny, and that they should be able to do so as long as they recognize as long as they recognize the fact that Israel's not going anywhere and it's here to stay. I mean, it's interesting that in the Israeli press these days, last couple of days, you see reports about people even inside Hamas in Gaza saying this is just not working. We're never really going to defeat them. So maybe the time has come really to start negotiating with Israel. Now, I don't know if that's a mainstream position or it's a very fringe position, if it'll get traction or it won't get traction. But if it's actually being said, it's already a change. So if you got more of that traction among Hamas in the southwest of Israel, and you got more of that traction among the Palestinians in the West Bank, you could begin to see a world in which the people would sit down and negotiate it. So I'm hopeful about that. What exactly the result will look like, I don't know, but some form of a two-state something or other. I'm still hopeful that we can get there.
Because you have mentioned the conflict and Hamas, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the longest and the most controversial conflicts in the last century, let's say it. Also the most polarizing. People all over the world, also in Romania, tend to assume a partisan stand on one side or the other, often without, discussing facts. So what are the major features of this conflict? Is it a battle for the land, like Amos Oz used to say? Is it an identity conflict? It is about religion, about geopolitics?
It's very simple, really very simple. Hamas wants to destroy the state of Israel. They say that. They don't hide that. It's in their charter. And when they go out and they chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they're not talking about going back to the 67 borders. They're talking about eradicating the state of Israel, which means there's some 6 million Jews here. It's a little bit more, which means basically an end to, where are they going to go, these Jews? So basically, there is one group called Hamas, which wants to basically kill the Jews who are here. And there's a long-standing European tradition of wanting to do that. And now it's spread to the Middle East. And there's another group here called the Jews who refuse to be killed. And until one side or the other compromises, we're going to have a conflict. And obviously, we're not going to compromise on our ability to stay here, our ability to stay alive. So we're just not going to compromise. Why would we? So until they change their position about wanting to destroy the state of Israel, we're going to be in a conflict. I say that not cavalierly. I don't say that happily. I don't say that as if I don't care. That the price is terrible for both sides. But at the end of the day, the conflict exists because Hamas refuses to accept the legitimacy of Israel and Israel's existence. Now, part of what makes Hamas much more desperate these days is that the rest of the Arab world is actually changing, right? In other words, you look at the Abraham Accords, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain said, Israel's here to stay. We're prepared to have relationships with Israel, to do business, to have tourism, science, technology, and all of that. Egypt already said that. Jordan already said that a long time ago. Egypt in 78, 79, Jordan in 94, Bahrain and the UAE now in 2020. And then in 2020 also followed Sudan and Morocco and even Saudi Arabia.
So-called Abraham Accords.
Right. And so Saudi Arabia was even also making some sort of noises about coming to some sort of new relationship with Israel. Even Israeli Arabs, by the way, Arabs who are part of Israel and are full citizens of Israel and are engaged in the political process, they've also been getting much more involved in Israeli politics. You saw that until a couple of weeks ago, it looked like we were going to have a government that the kingmaker was going to be this Ra'am party, an Israeli Arab party that got a small handful of votes. I think that's great. That's how a democracy works. It doesn't matter whether I agree with the party or don't agree with the party. They have a right to vote and they got votes and they should be able to do what they want to do. So basically the only people in the world, in the Arab world, who were not moving towards some kind of an accommodation with Israel is Hamas, because other Arab countries are moving to an accommodation. Israeli Arabs are moving to an accommodation. It's the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, who are the last holdouts and refusing to move. And they recognize that they are being marginalized and isolated by their own Muslim, Arab cousins, whatever. And I understand this war that just happened the last couple of weeks as an attempt by Hamas, by the way, and a successful attempt to get the Palestinian plight back on the front pages of the newspapers.
So what you are saying is that this conflict between Israel and Hamas is not the same conflict between Israel and Palestinians. Because Fatah is not Hamas, for example.
No, but Fatah is also really fundamentally not yet said publicly that it is willing to accept Israel's existence. So they are different, but they are different forms of a very similar thing. Fundamentally, I think that the splitting of the hairs, whether this is about land or about identity or about religion or about geopolitics, that's all secondary. The fundamental issue is, do those people believe that Israel has a right to exist in some portion of the land in which we now find ourselves? Hamas is clear, absolutely not. Yes. Abbas is a little bit more murky. But if you go to the streets of the West Bank, the streets of Ramallah, the streets of Nablus and other kinds of places, there you'll hear on the street people say absolutely Israel has no right to exist. So there are subtle differences, but fundamentally this conflict is not about land or religion or identity or geopolitics. It is about the question of whether or not Israel has a right to exist. On that, we're not going to compromise, right? I mean, there's no reason that we possibly would. So until they're willing to accept that we're here and we're here to stay, there's not going to be any conversation. Once there's a conversation, then everything is up for grabs. We can talk about borders, we can talk about policies, we can talk about all of that.
So Abraham Accords aren't in danger because of this?
I hope not. I hope not. I mean, everybody in Israel was very, I mean, in Israel from left to right, there was really tremendous excitement about the Abraham Accords. And I think one of the things that indicates that they're not in danger, there's two reasons to think that they're not in danger. One is a larger one and one is a smaller indication. The larger reason is because, of course, why did the UAE and Bahrain make the deal in the first place? Because it's good for them. In other words, it's good for them to have access to Israeli technology. Israel has the technology, they have the capital. Israeli companies are looking for investment capital, which Bahrain and the UAE have in abundance. Bahrain and the UAE are looking for both strategic military cooperation, but also just general investment opportunities in technology, and that Israel has in abundance. Now, nothing about the last 2 weeks changes any of that. I mean, that's all entirely still true. So it's still in the interests of Bahrain and the UAE and other countries as well to keep those relationships going. That's the reason. The indication that I think that they're not in danger is that if they wanted to sound a warning, they could have actually recalled their ambassadors, for example, or they could have called in the Israeli ambassador for a talking to and, whatever. But they didn't. That's kind of the way that the diplomatic dance goes, right? Nobody danced that dance this time. They didn't call anybody in. They didn't call anybody back. They said some things to make it clear that they're not abandoning their Palestinian brothers and sisters. But then life went on as usual, and everybody understands what that means. We don't want to publicly dissociate ourselves from you, but we're not throwing our lot in with your decision to go to war with Israel. We're in a different place. We want peace with Israel. We want peace in the region. By the way, it's also very important to recognize that Hamas is kind of a satellite a little bit of Iran, and Islamic Jihad, which is the other terrorist organization based in Gaza, is a directly controlled entity at the hands of Iran. It's very important to remember that the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia all see Iran as a critical enemy. So they actually are interested in a relationship with Israel because Israel and they share, and Egypt also, Saudi Arabia also, share a great fear of Iran. To the extent that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are offshoots of Iran, there's very little sympathy among the Egyptians or the Saudi Arabians, the Bahrainians or the Emiratis for Hamas because it's just kind of Iran writ large, and Iran threatens them also.
What about Turkey and Erdogan?
Turkey is a more complicated situation. I mean, Turkey, of course, under Erdogan, Turkey has moved from being a democracy to really being a dictatorship. Israelis understand that. I think the Turks understand that. Erdogan will do what's good for Turkey and what's good for Erdogan. He has been of late making noises that he wanted to warm up ties with Israel. Of course, when there's a battle between the Palestinians and Israel, he has to come out and say all the things that he said in the last couple of weeks. But he didn't do anything. I mean, he didn't send a flotilla of ships. He didn't send arms to Hamas. He didn't, he didn't say that Turkish Airlines can't fly to Israel. There's all kinds. Israelis fly Turkish Airlines actually quite a lot. And Istanbul is a very important stopover for Israelis going to Europe, even going to America, believe it or not. Right. So Erdogan is interested in Erdogan, and Erdogan is interested in what's good for Turkey. He'll side with the Palestinians if he thinks it'll buy him some loyalty, and he'll side with the Israelis if he thinks it'll buy him some stability. And that's the game that he plays.
Okay.
Nobody's very worried about Turkey as an actor in this right now.
Okay. Wasn't the escalation of these days predictable? For Mossad, for example? No.
No, nobody predicted it. In other words, I think everybody was surprised by it. I think Hamas was surprised by it, and Israel was surprised by it. Now, what happened was, it's what we call in English a game of chicken, right? You want to see who's going to blink first. So there was Hamas and the Palestinian Authority both had a vested interest in stoking the flames of the tension inside Jerusalem. Literally, I don't know, a 20-minute walk from where I'm sitting right now. And certainly as the crow flies, just a couple of kilometers, a kilometer maybe. Now, why did the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas have a vested interest in stoking those flames? Because Abbas was elected in January 2005 for a 4-year term. So he is now in the 16th year of a 4-year term. He called elections for May. Everybody here understood that he was not going to have elections. But he said he was, and then he began to see that if you had elections, Hamas was going to win. So he said, so I'm canceling the elections. Now, nobody was surprised. Actually, Israel was also a little bit relieved, because we don't want Hamas taking over the West Bank either. So we were more than happy for him to cancel the elections. It's up to him. We don't control it. But if he wants to cancel the elections, that's okay. But he wanted to take the spotlight away from his canceled elections and move it to something else. And if he could stoke the flames of tension in Jerusalem, then the story in the newspapers would be Israeli policemen on the Temple Mount and not Mahmoud Abbas canceled elections. So he had a vested interest. Hamas, for the reasons that I already discussed with you, was feeling very marginalized and very isolated, no longer part of the picture. They had a vested interest in stirring the pot. So what they did is 2 weeks ago today exactly, they announced to Israel, if you don't get off the Temple Mount by 6 p.m., we're going to fire rockets at Jerusalem. And I was here. We all said, yeah, right. In other words, you're going to fire rockets at Jerusalem. In fact, when they did fire the rockets at Jerusalem, exactly as they promised, I was out on a bicycle ride in an Arab village. Now, if I had felt that they were going to fire rockets at 6 o'clock, I would not have chosen to be out on my bicycle in an Arab village. That would have not been very smart. Nobody here thought that they were going to do it. But once they did it, Israel felt it had to respond. And Israel responded much more forcefully than Hamas thought it would. Usually they fire a few rockets, we fire a few rockets. But Israel said, this is enough already. You can't keep firing at Israeli civilians. Imagine, for example, that people were firing from Mexico or Canada onto Washington, D.C. Is the United States going to sort of drop a little missile back and a little? No, they're going to find whoever's doing it, and they're going to destroy them. Now, we didn't destroy Hamas, but we hit back much harder than Hamas thought. Then Hamas unleashed massive volleys trying to overwhelm the Iron Dome system. So we hit back, and the whole thing kind of sprung out of control. But I don't think it was predictable. I don't think anybody here really thought it was going to happen. Now, is there a possibility that somebody inside the Mossad wrote a memo to somebody and saying this is going to happen? Yeah, I'm sure that that's possible. But as far as the Israeli public is aware, everybody was caught by surprise, including the political commentators and the military commentators in Israel's very robust journalistic system where there are different viewpoints and all that. Most people were really very surprised by the turn that this took. And we were even more surprised and more horrified by the violence that broke out between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. I mean, there were two very different stories here. They happened at the same time, and they are a little bit connected, but not really connected. They are totally different stories. And that one is a much more serious issue for Israel. The internal violence between Jews and Arabs inside Israel is the beginnings of a little bit of a civil war. Is too extreme, but it's very, very worrisome.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I quote from Chaim Weizmann, is Israel's first president. I am certain that the world will judge the Jewish state by what it will do with its Arab population. So everybody is talking about Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, but few are actually talking about Arabs and Jews in Israel. What happened, for example, in these years after Haifa Declaration?
After what?
Haifa Declaration, when Arabs from Israel made a political statement.
Oh, they do that a lot. I mean, that's their right. It's democracy. That's not terribly unusual. Look, I think let's talk about the good part of the story first, right? Israeli Arabs have the same legal rights that I do as an Israeli Jew. They can vote. They get full medical care. They can go to the universities and they're Israelis. They're as Israeli as I am, not one little bit less. Especially under Bibi Netanyahu's administration, a lot more money has actually been invested in infrastructure in the Arab areas, which is why it's interesting that Mansour Abbas, who's the head of the Ra'am party, before he decided to sign on with Bennett and Lapid, who are in the center, he was very seriously exploring the possibility of signing on with Bibi. Now, Bibi Netanyahu. Now, some people scratch their heads and they say, why? I mean, he's a right-winger, Bibi. So why would the Israeli Arabs side with him? Because they are actually similar in many ways. They're very socially conservative. Israeli Arabs much rather that their sons and daughters live the way that traditional religious Jews live than secular Tel Aviv, which is kind of, the whole Western scene, whether it's, the gay and lesbian issue or people living together outside of marriage or all that, it's a typical Western city. They are much less attracted to that than they are to the way of life of traditional Israeli Jews. So ironically, people don't understand this outside of Israel, but ironically, Israeli Arabs feel much closer in terms of their values to traditional Jews than they do to secular Jews, even though the traditional Jews are actually more right-wing politically and the secular Jews are more left-wing. So, I mean, the good story about this, for example, during the Corona pandemic and during COVID, Israel is basically done with COVID. I mean, we have lifted all restrictions except for masks inside with more than 100 people. But outside, there's no masks. Theaters are open, museums are open, restaurants are open, not just outside. I mean, it's just over. I mean, we had, I think, yesterday, in a country of 9 million people, we had 16 new cases yesterday. I mean, it's nothing. It's basically over. And one of the great stories about Corona or COVID, I don't know how it's called in Romania. Here they call it Corona. In America, they call it COVID. But whichever one it was, one of the great things about that was that Israeli Arabs are very heavily represented in the healthcare system in Israel. Doctors, nurses, medical technicians. So those of us who happen to be Israeli Jews knew very well that if we were going to get sick and get taken to the emergency room because we got the virus, the chances that we would be cared for by an Israeli Arab were actually very high. And it created a real sense of shared purpose. And there were really beautiful pictures of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs working in emergency rooms, working in ambulances. There really was a sense of shared purpose here. Now, underneath the surface, though, it's important to remember that there are still problems. Those problems range from, and they're all very complex, and there's no easy solution to any of them. One of the problems is a higher rate of unemployment among young Israeli Arab men, unfortunately, because of a lower level of education. They choose to drop out of high school. They don't have to. I mean, we have high schools, but they choose very often to drop out, to go to work for the family business. But then that limits them in terms of the jobs that they can get and so forth. There's an unemployment problem and a poverty problem. There's also a problem of violence among Israeli Arabs, between Arabs and Arabs in Arab towns and villages in this country, and a tremendous number of guns that are in those communities. And there's been an outcry among Israeli Arabs. Why are the Israeli police, not doing more to punish these people and so on and so forth? But it's complicated because Israeli Arabs typically don't want to testify in court about Israeli Arabs. They're afraid. So the police kind of feel, why would I risk my life to go in there and try to arrest these people when I know they can't be convicted because nobody's going to testify? So it's very, very complicated. But so there are frustrations. And of course, a major frustration is that they remember that, I mean, they obviously don't remember personally, but they know that 100 years ago or 150 years ago, this was an entirely Muslim region or Arab region, mostly Muslim, somewhat Christian, but all Arab region. And then Jews fleeing anti-Semitism in Europe came here and over the course of time became more numerous and built a state. As Jews, we see that as a story of great success. They see it as having lost not their territory in war, but just having lost the part of the world in which they were the dominant culture and so on and so forth. And there's still very real tension about that. And some of that exploded. Now, I think it's very important to point out that while there was a good deal of violence over the course of the last 2 weeks between Jews and Arabs, it was the fringes on both sides. Now, I don't know what the number was, if it was 10% or 7%, whatever it was, but it wasn't 50%, and it wasn't 40%, and it wasn't 30%. It was fringes on both sides. It was radical Muslims and radical Jews. And unfortunately, I'm sure there are radicals in Romania too on all different sorts of issues. Every country has them. So while this is a very serious issue and it needs to be addressed, it's important not to exaggerate the percentage of people who were involved in it. It was a relatively small percentage of people, extremists on both sides. We have a lot of work to do to rebuild the sense of trust. But it's important to recognize that it was a small, violent group on each side who did this, not a massive civil war where everybody was participating.
Okay, so what are your fears regarding Arabs and Jews in Israel? Because it's a cleavage. Israel has many cleavages within, for example, between, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. And you write about this in your book, translated into Romanian. So
right. I didn't check the translation, but I trust that it's accurate. So
yes, it's accurate. So it's
okay. I don't know.
The constant history of a nation reborn for
but I'm saying they sent me the book and I have it here, but I unfortunately don't speak Romanian. So but I'm honored. I'm very honored that it appeared in Romanian. Romania. It's a very obviously important country in Europe with a lot of very thoughtful people. And there's a lot of Israelis who hail from Romania. So there's a feeling of it's an important country to us. So I was very honored that the book came out in Romanian. So for example, let's take some of the cleavages that you quite rightly pointed to. The cleavages between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, for example, is disappearing. I mean, it's really disappearing. When a Mizrahi and an Ashkenazi get married these days, nobody even notices. It's not even interesting. It's like saying when a person with blue eyes and a person with brown eyes gets married, who cares? I mean, it's really, nobody pays attention. We used to pray in very different synagogues, and more people are sharing synagogue spaces. We prayed in different synagogues, by the way, not out of racism, but because our liturgies are very different. Our prayers are different. But more and more, we're beginning to share. The Mizrahim have made tremendous progress economically, sociologically, professionally. So that cleavage is definitely, I think, beginning to be irrelevant. It's not irrelevant yet, but it is still there, but it's beginning to be irrelevant. There's a cleavage that you didn't mention, but I'm sure you know about, which of course is the cleavage between most Israeli Jews, including religious Jews, and the ultra-Orthodox. That may also be undergoing some shift because of what happened during Corona. In other words, during Corona, they insisted on keeping their schools open. They insisted on having funerals with thousands of people and weddings with thousands of people. And then they died. I mean, a significant percentage of them, I mean, it doesn't sound like a big number, but I think 1% of ultra-Orthodox Jews over 65 years old died. That's a huge number, 1%. Yeah. I mean, think in Romania, if 1% of Romania was to die, God forbid, that's a huge number.
But at the end of the day, they obeyed the rules.
They began to obey, but they recognized that they started to obey at the end of the day after they'd already paid a very high price. And they're actually asking themselves a lot of questions about what's our relationship with the state going to be? Can we keep rejecting the authority of the state, or is it beginning to hurt us ourselves? So that's a cleavage. There's a cleavage between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, which if there's any silver lining to the horrible things that happened these past 2 weeks, the silver lining is that I think the issue of Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews is now already getting much more attention. And the answer, by the way, is not money. It's not a problem you can throw money at. I don't know about Romanian politics, I'm ashamed to say, but if I follow American politics, because I'm from America originally, there's a huge race problem in America right now. It has economic implications, but the problem of race in America cannot be fixed by throwing money at it. It's not a money problem. It's an attitude problem. It's a racism problem. It's et cetera, et cetera. The same thing is true here. It's not a money problem. We have to actually build an awareness on both sides of the narrative that the other side tells. And I don't think we focused on that enough. We assume that as long as they're getting more jobs and as long as their birth rate is coming down. Why is that important? Because it indicates that they're joining the Western world more and more. Israeli Arab women and Israeli Jewish women now have the same birth rate. because they're
money don't resolve, I don't know, identity problems or frustration regarding
Correct.
identity.
Exactly. So we still have those identity issues. And I think what's important is not to try to change somebody's identity, but I think Israeli Jews need to understand how Israeli Arabs see this country and see this situation. And Israeli Arabs need more and more to try to understand how Israeli Jews, we're always both going to be here. Nobody's leaving. The Jews aren't leaving and the Arabs aren't leaving. Mm-hmm. And so it's important for us to begin to build understanding and trust with one another, even if we don't have exactly the same narrative about what this country is. We have to have much more dialogue and much more understanding and much more shared cooperative ventures to know each other. I mean, it's just a matter of when you talk to Israeli doctors who work along, whether they're Jews or Arabs, what they'll say is because we spend all day in the same operating room or in the same emergency room, we know each other. We know about our spouses, our husbands or wives, and we know about our children. We see each other as human beings, not as a different group. And that's simply what has to happen here as well. And I'm quite optimistic that we can do it. If you ask me what worries me, which was your question, if we cannot do that, then this country is going to always have a very serious internal cleavage that will periodically get violent. And that'll be a disaster for this country. But I'm not that worried about it, only because I believe that there's a tremendous amount of goodwill, both on the side of Israeli Jews and on the side of Israeli Arabs, to heal the pain that was caused in the last couple of weeks and to dig much deeper and to ask ourselves, why did this happen? And what can we do to make sure that a generation from now, we have moved forward significantly from where we are at the present?
Mm-hmm. And there is this cleavage also within Arab community between Palestinians and Druze, for example.
Yeah, there is, right? Druze and Bedouin and Arabs and Cherkessians and Christians and Muslims. That's human beings in every country in the world. There are cleavages between religions and ethnicities and socioeconomic levels, and especially in the Middle East, where tribal roots have such an important role to play. So there are cleavages there also. That's all very complicated and far beyond the parameters of our conversation today, but you're right, those cleavages also exist.
After Donald Trump's decision regarding Middle East, regarding Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do you think that Biden administration will change something?
No, look, first of all, I don't think Donald Trump did anything about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He didn't improve it, but he didn't make it worse. He just ignored the problem. What he did was the Abraham Accords, he or his son-in-law, whatever. And the Abraham Accords is a good thing. I mean, I was not a huge fan of Donald Trump, to put it very mildly, but that was actually a good thing. And I believe that it's going to hold the test of time. There were a lot of Israelis who were very worried about Biden because the Democratic Party in America is moving far to the left. You have Bernie Sanders, you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you have a bunch of people. And people were really very worried about Biden. But there was a sense, not everybody, but there was a sense among many Israelis here that Biden did quite well the last few weeks. In other words, he's not Donald Trump, and nobody expected him to be, but he clearly came out several times saying that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself and that the United States relationship with Israel is an unbreakable bond. He waited really basically 2 full weeks before he said to Netanyahu, look, you have to shut this down. I mean, at the end of the day, that's clearly what he said to Netanyahu. You have 24, 48 hours, you got to shut it down. But he could have said that a week earlier. And he didn't. In other words, he purposely gave Israel the time to do what Israel needed to do militarily. So I think that there's actually, among many people in Israel, a sense that Biden is an old-fashioned Democrat, meaning he's from the generation of Democrats where Israel was a bipartisan issue, where Republicans and Democrats at least agreed about Israel. There's not many of those Democrats left anymore, right? Biden is, an older guy. He's probably the last generation of Democrats who are like that. But I think people feel that Biden actually did quite fine last couple of weeks.
So it's my last question. What are the political consequences in Israel of this new escalation of the conflict? Because we were supposed to have election in Palestine, but also Prime Minister Netanyahu was practically ready to lose power. Yeah. I quote Fâșia Gaza, for example, who wrote on Facebook, when we thought that Netanyahu will leave, he's back.
Right. So I don't know if he's back or not.
Okay.
I mean, you're right. He was this close to being out.
Mm.
And now it looks to a certain extent like it's not clear, first of all, if the Ra'am Arab Party is going to be able to join that coalition because of the tension between Israeli Arabs and Jews. But the assumption was during the war, which just ended a few days ago, that Naftali Bennett, who's basically a right-winger, but is opposed to Bibi Netanyahu, and therefore had signed on with Lapid, the assumption during the war was, okay, that's over. He's not going to do that. He's not going to move to a centrist coalition. He's going to move to the right-wing coalition. But in fact, that seems not to have been the case. In other words, it looks very much like Bennett is still lambasting Netanyahu for his conduct of the war and for, all these years of all the various things that he's done. So I share Fania Salzober's worry about it. I do worry about it. But I'm actually pleasantly surprised to see that the possibility of a centrist coalition in which Bibi might be out, it's not over. It's really not clear. And I think now Netanyahu is going to be very worried about going to a fifth election. We've had 4 now in the last 2 years because nobody can really win. I think he's going to be very worried about going to a fifth because after a war like this, in which especially the right wing is angry with him for not having done more damage to Hamas, he may see himself as being politically vulnerable. So it's, I don't think anybody would be wise to bet on money on where this is going because I don't think anybody knows, but there is much more chance of a centrist coalition than I would have guessed a week ago.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
It's really a pleasure to meet you. I wish you all the very best.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.